Are you ready for rapid fire, Jesse?
Let's do this thing.
All right, here we go. Which has the better chance to happen this season? Jadarian Price rushes for at least 1,000 yards, or Kyngstonn Viliamu-Asa has at least 100 tackles?
I like this question because I wouldn't say Jadarian Price is second fiddle to Jeremiah Love, but like it's a 1A, 1B situation. And KVA is kind of the same kind of conversation when you're talking about him and Drake Bowen, in my opinion. So I think Drake Bowen's going to be the guy majority of the tackles this season on defense. There's some people who think Drake Bowen's not even going to be a starter by the end of the season, I think, which is really crazy. But I'm going to go Jadarian Price at the end of the day. I think his game and Jeremiah Love's game is going to open up nicely with CJ Carr's ability to pass the ball, get the ball downfield a little bit more. I think naturally that's going to kind of alleviate things for them. So I think both of these guys are really going to be nearing 1,000 yards by the end of the season. And bold prediction, I think both guys, I think they're going to have 2,000-yard rushers.
I'm thinking there's a really good chance that happens as well because, you got to remember, Price ran for almost 750 himself last year. Love had over 1,100 yards, and Riley Leonard ran for over 900 yards. So you take Leonard out of the equation, and sure, we expect more passing yards. The team threw for nearly 3,200 last year, and that's the team, not Riley Leonard, but the team threw for nearly 3,200. And, so like, even though we expect more out of the passing game this year, to your point, that gives you leads. And when you have the lead, what do? You run the ball more, and you've got two fully dynamic running backs in the backfield. I think that there's a really good chance both of these guys, both Love and Price, end up with 1,000. And then, like you look at the tackles, it's actually been 3 years since Notre Dame had a guy hit 100 tackles. J.D. Bertrand had 100 back in 2022. Jack Kaiser led the team with 90 last year, and Viliamu-Asa, as part of that rotation, only had 37. I do expect his tackle number to go up, but I think, more than likely it'll probably get into the 80 to 85 range would be kind of my guess if I'm putting a number on it right now. So I think it's more likely that Jadarian Price ends up over 1,000 yards, along with Jeremiah Love, also over 1,000 yards this season. So I think we're in the same boat. Fill in the blank. The college football playoff era began in 2014, and it's blank that Notre Dame's 109 wins ranked number 5 in the nation in that time.
I might, make a lot of people mad with this next statement, but to me, it's meaningless. You have 0 national championships.
Wow. Okay.
You have 0 national championships, and before this season, you had 0 New Year's Six Bowl victories. I mean, to me, when I look at, sports, whether it's college, professional, I'm very much kind of first or last mentality. Like it's good to be a program that
Ricky Bobby
constantly wins games, and you're in that probably top 80, 90%. And in this case, you're like in the 99th percentile, but it's just, I want a championship, and maybe that's.
I think that's what everyone wants, right? They want a championship. I mean, and that's the next step. That's where they're at, because the teams that are in front of them.
That was going to actually be my follow-up question. When I read this question the first time, I was going to ask you, do 1 through 4 have a national championship?
Do you want to guess who 1 through 4 are?
Yeah, it's probably Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State. The last one's going to be the hardest. Maybe Clemson.
You got it. Those are the 4 teams that are ahead
of
Notre Dame.
They've
all got national championships.
Got multiple.
And that's kind of my point. And not only have those 4 teams all won national championships, they've combined to win 9 of the last 11 national championships. Michigan and LSU are the only.
So is it unfair to say that it's again, meaningless is too hard, but like.
No, but my point is Notre Dame is right there. They're knocking on the door. They're right behind the 4 big boys in that stretch. All they need now is a national championship to fully solidify themselves full-fledged kick down the door, you win a national championship, all the irrelevant stuff, everything else, that won't be a talking point again. Because, like, as much as you hear the irrelevant stuff, Notre Dame, in actuality, the only thing they haven't done is win the whole darn thing. Like that's all that they haven't done. They're right there behind the four best teams, and it's got to sting a little bit that Michigan sits right behind them, and that's what they've got. I guess it's not right behind it, but I think it's Oklahoma behind him, and then Michigan is next. So like that's literally the only thing missing on the resume right now. Win the national championship, and you don't have to worry anymore about this Notre Dame irrelevant stuff ever again.
Agreed. 100% agree.
But you're going like full bore sucking on lemons, like it doesn't matter because they haven't won the national championship.
Winning has never been an issue for Notre Dame.
It's winning the big games. But
yeah,
to your point, like you brought up earlier, Marcus Freeman now has won the big games. Like he showed last year that Notre Dame can win those games.
That's when we opened the show. That was the first question. And that's exactly what it is. Marcus Freeman has really turned things around in terms of perspective and on-field results. He's a likable guy, and he's actually winning the important games. Brian Kelly, super unlikable, never won a meaningful game.
I agree with that. I'm trying to see if I can find that list because I delete. Here it is. It's not. Hang on a second. Yeah, so Notre Dame has 109 wins in that time. Oklahoma actually has 108. Boise State 106, a little bit surprising. Against a different kind of schedule, though, obviously. Oregon 103, Michigan 102, Penn State 101. That's the list. Alabama leads the way with 136. Clemson and Ohio State each have 129, and Georgia has 125. This is since 2014. And as Brian said, just don't let Penn State beat you to it. That would be pretty critical, I think, as well. Okay, Jesse. How has what you think of Chad Bowden changed since he left Notre Dame for Southern Cal at the end of the season?
Yeah, I thought about this question a lot, and last season, when he kind of got uncomfortable and he wasn't, he was kind of asking for more money and more this and that. It really felt like you could start to feel the pump go on his ego a little bit, right? And ever since he's left for USC, that ego has just gotten super inflated, in my opinion. And the reason why I say that is it really feels like he thinks he is like the integral part of Notre Dame's success,
right,
the last 3 to 4 years.
Like
and
it was more him.
He's going to be the integral success for turning USC around and getting them back on the map. And the fact that he's, obviously in communications with players who are at Notre Dame still. And I'm sure that anytime that there's the slightest bit of, discomfort, hey, why don't you come over to USC? We got a spot for you. It's just going to be an ongoing thing until the kind of the class of guys that he helped recruit are fully through Notre Dame. He's always going to think he's kind of the guy who got Notre Dame back on track, and he's going to be the reason why USC is going to get back on track. And so I just keep seeing this ego inflate. And I'm not trying to take anything away from him. He was a big part of, the recruiting at Notre Dame, but Marcus Freeman was the biggest part. And I think he thinks at times he's probably more valuable than Marcus Freeman.
Well, and look at how the defensive line recruiting has improved in the short amount of time since he's been gone. And the fact that they keep hauling in, even like more guys in the secondary and a receiver, like the recruiting, I think that you could argue in the short amount of time, because I know some people were frustrated. It's like, wait, when are they going to capitalize on the playoff run? Well, they've been getting some hits here in the last month or so, since they've been able to get these guys to commit, the two defensive ends. And like, to your point about the in contact with current players, because look, the transfer portal has been closed for not quite a week, and obviously he came right after Kennedy Urlacher, and Urlacher was buried on the depth chart, and that made sense. But sure sounds like he was making a run at other guys who were not in the transfer portal. A lot of tampering type stuff going on, and that's
trying
what
to influence some guys.
Yeah, and that's like,
Get in their ear
like,
a little bit.
I get you've got relationships with them, but like that is like digging in the dirt, rolling around in the mud type stuff to me.
Oh, but
like
he
at
would
least keep it above the belt, like have a little class, have some class, especially when you're talking about, like a guy, who you worked for, who brought you over here from Cincinnati, who was supposed to be your friend. Have a little class, So like my opinion of him has dropped considerably when you hear about this, like the rumblings of the tampering and all this stuff, trying to poach other guys from the roster who aren't even in the transfer portal yet, when it's obviously very clear, especially had they ended up there, like why they would have ended up there.
100%.
Did you have something else? I feel like I might have cut you off there at one point. All right, so we've got this new game that we play here on the show, and it is called Predict the Vegas Over-Under Season Win Total for different teams. We did Indiana yesterday. That ticked some people off because apparently we talked about Indiana too long, even though we were talking about a lot of other teams as well. But we pick a different team in rapid fire, and we go through the schedule, and we predict what Fan Duel has their over-under season win total to be. So today, it is Arizona State. So here's what Arizona State's schedule looks like. They start off by hosting Northern Arizona.
Win.
Then they travel to Mississippi State. Then they host Texas State. They go to Baylor. They host TCU. They go to Utah. They host Texas Tech and then Houston. Then they go to Iowa State. They host West Virginia. They go to Colorado. And they host Arizona. So, Jesse, before I open up my FanDuel app here on my phone, what do you think Vegas is going to set Arizona State's over-under win total for 2025?
9.5.
You're going 9.5?
Yes.
Look at this. Is not an overly tough schedule by any stretch. Like, there is no game on there. There is no game at all where I would say, man, that's a definite loss. Would you?
No.
I don't think so either.
There's really only like 2 or 3 that I'm like, that could go either way. Maybe.
Tommy agrees with you. He's going 9.5. I am Tenzin. I am the son of Aang is going 7.5. Important to note that Arizona State, even though they lost, the guy that everyone seems to love, Cam Skattebo, they returned 17 starters from last year's team that won the Big 12. So I agree with Jesse. I am going 9.5 on this. My initial instinct was 8.5, but looking at the schedule even closer, I think it is a very manageable schedule. So are you locked in on 9.5 before I open this up?
Yes.
Here we go. Arizona State, 8.5.
Wow.
Should have gone with my instinct.
Wow.
With my instinct. I missed again. 8.5 is the number for Arizona State. All right. This is the first time you've done this, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I like it though, and I thought we were going to go through the schedule too and go like win loss.
Like,
maybe it's more interesting to talk about where the losses could come from.
Yeah, that's true. We can do that on the next one that we do. All right, Mel Kiper Jr.'s reaction to the Shedeur Sanders slide to the 5th round was probably as polarizing as Sanders himself in the draft last weekend. Some people even said Kiper should be fired for doubling down on being so wrong. So my question to you,
Oh
was
man.
Kiper's draft performance good or bad for ESPN?
So here's my thing. This isn't centralized to Mel Kiper. Mel Kiper just couldn't shut up about it the entire draft, is what the issue was, in my opinion. There's a lot of people across the board who had Shedeur Sanders, like you talk about like big board, like the guy on NFL Network. I can't think of his name right now, but he had Shedeur Sanders as like his 20th overall prospect, right? Like
Daniel Jeremiah, maybe?
Daniel Jeremiah. I knew it was. I wanted to say his first name was Jeremiah, but I was like, that can't be right. So yes, Daniel Jeremiah. Like this, no one predicted him to be this low. He was a highly rated, on the big board for a reason. I think Mel Kiper's where he went wrong is he just couldn't stop talking about it, and he couldn't stop bringing it up, and he couldn't. Like you gotta drop it and focus
And then
on
every quarterback that, got drafted, in the meantime, before Sanders, he kept, hitting it again.
And so if you look at Mel Kiper's resume or track record, he's been doing this for a long time, and he's right more than he's wrong, in my opinion, on overall kind of consensus of how good a player is or isn't. So I have no problem with where these guys had him slated in terms of being a top, a first round pick, top 20 pick, wherever. I think where it went wrong is you start taking the spotlight away from other people on their probably, best day of their life because you want to keep talking about Shedeur Sanders at the end of the day.
Right.
You got to give credit to these other guys, talk about them, they got drafted. That's a lifelong dream for so many people. Like I think that's where the disservice was, is you took away attention from other deserving people because you just kept talking about Shedeur Sanders.
Yeah, it started right off the top of the draft when Cam Ward gets picked, and Barrett, like literally, I had walked into the kitchen, at the start of the draft because I knew that Cam Ward was going to be picked, and by the time I walked back into my living room, it's like, hold it, what? Jaguars trade to number 2, and then it went straight to that, and then of course part of that conversation was also because Kiper had Shedeur as his number 1 quarterback. Again, like Cam Ward just got completely lost in the shuffle. And then everything for the rest of the first round became about the fact that Sanders wasn't getting picked. And obviously the next 2 days became about that. But to answer the question, like Mel Kiper, like in his mind, he's right and he's doubling down on being right. I have no problem with that, even though, like he's a draft guy. He's not going to nail every pick, because like they're not up there tipping picks. He's not going to get everything right. At the end of the day, it is still his opinion and his evaluation. And like his whole thing about, the NFL has been wrong for 50 years about evaluating quarterbacks. Well, like Mel Kiper's most famous moment is about going at Bill Tobin, of the Indianapolis Colts because they took Trev Alberts instead of Trent Dilfer. So like Kiper ultimately may have been right. Like Dilfer did win a Super Bowl, but it's not like Trent Dilfer otherwise had such a great career that like it obviously had to be Trent Dilfer instead of Trev Alberts in 1993. So Kiper was right to a shade. But in this instance, it's nothing but good for ESPN because ultimately the draft is about entertainment and having, eyeballs and opinions. And Mel Kiper obviously has very strong opinions on who he thinks, should go, at different points. Now, like personally, I didn't keep watching ESPN's draft coverage because like it did go overboard to me. But if you look at the draft ratings on ESPN, they were up on Friday and Saturday. Now, a lot of that has to do with Shedeur Sanders and the fact that he was still there. But as Brian M.Y. says, Kiper is the draft. He gets a pass from him. No one person's name is more synonymous with the NFL draft than Mel Kiper Jr. That's just the way it is.
2 final thoughts on this.
So that's good for ESPN.
I still think Shedeur Sanders is going to be a better quarterback than Jackson Dart. So good luck, Giants. And number 2, no football has been played yet. Mel Kiper could still be right. Shedeur Sanders could still be the starter for the Cleveland Browns next season.
Yeah.
You know, there's still a lot to happen between now and the first game of next season. Like,
Wouldn't it be crazy if that happens, by the way?
Exactly. Just because he wasn't, drafted when everyone else thought, like, we're just going to dump on Kiper and everyone and say, oh, you're all wrong. Things could change. Maybe this sparks a fire under Shedeur Sanders and he gets, more of his act together and he trains harder and he becomes a better, like, all of the above, like, there's still time for this to play out to ultimately decide who was right and who was wrong. Just because they weren't drafted in a certain range doesn't mean that the player isn't talented or good at the end of the day.
Right. Scott says he wasn't doubling down. He was 2,000 times down. Jesse nailed it with stealing dozens of kids' shining moments. I agree with that. Also, Kiper has been terrible historically with quarterbacks. All that may be true. And to a large extent, it is true. Like, because again, like no one's going back and like picking apart every, slot that Mel Kiper, in all of his rankings for the last 40 years, basically. But the point is, people have been talking about it and people were tweeting about it. And the fact that people feel so strongly about it is nothing but good for ESPN.
Right.
And that was the point of my question. Was it good or bad for ESPN? It's nothing but good for ESPN because everyone's talking about it and they had millions of eyeballs on the draft over the weekend. So like you can love him or hate him, but that's what makes good TV. Someone or something that's going to be polarizing, whether it's the New York Yankees, the Los Angeles Lakers, Notre Dame, the Dallas Cowboys. Take your pick. If you have just as many people hating as loving, if you have just as many people
still
on
fans.
each side, that's what sells.
They're
ultimately.
still watching.
Yeah.
If you're a Cowboys fan, you either love watch them or you hate watch them, but you're still watching.
Exactly. Now, you brought up the Cleveland Browns, and obviously that's where Shedeur Sanders ended up going. Kirk Cousins was going into the draft, like he was supposedly on the Cleveland Browns radar. He's going to be 37 years old when the NFL season begins. Falcons general manager Terry Fontenot was on Mad Dog Radio yesterday, and he said that the Falcons are being patient and taking calls about Cousins right now. What do you think Kirk Cousins' future holds, Jess?
He ends up on a team with that has a crappy quarterback, or he ends up on a team that's desperate for quarterback. But
I don't know who that is though right now.
Well, I do, but it'll kind of lead us into our next question, so I'll wait for that one.
Okay.
Kirk Cousins, I think, still has some football left in him, and if you're like, I hate that I have to do this, but they should have, teams should they should look into the strategy that the Giants should have taken, and that's get an old quarterback, find a stopgap for the next year or two while you dig into maybe a quarterback that you like in the next upcoming drafts that you can reset on. I think Kirk Cousins is a perfect kind of bridge the gap type quarterback where maybe you're not really committed on going all in, but you still get a guy with a ton of experience and can be serviceable for a couple seasons. And I think that's what Russell Westbrook's going to do with the Giants. The Giants are just idiotic and drafted quarterbacks for some reason, wasted picks. I don't know why. But I think that's the perfect landing spot for Kirk Cousins, is on a team that might not know what they want to do with quarterback in the next couple of years, but he can kind of give them more time to figure it out.
Yeah, but it feels like the Jets would have been a logical landing spot, or even the Giants before they made the moves to get Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston, or obviously Cleveland, before they drafted two quarterbacks. And, by the way, I am Tenzin says Watson, Flacco, Gabriel, Sanders. Did I miss anybody? Yes, Kenny Pickett is part of that mix. And Watson is hurt, so he won't actually even be in the mix. So it's going to be Flacco, Gabriel, Sanders, and Kenny Pickett.
Yeah, he's hurt,
at least for right now. Brian M.Y. says Seattle. Well, they just signed Sam Darnold, so Darnold is perfectly set up there. And, the Raiders are set right now with Geno Smith. So to me, it really feels like, because the draft is already passed and pretty much everybody else is set, I just think Kirk Cousins is at the stage now at 37 years old that his lot in life is probably just to be a backup quarterback. Like, I think that that's probably what he's going to be. He's going to be the veteran, where kind of like maybe what you're saying, next year, if he's able to find a team, it's probably going to be with a team that is going to draft a young quarterback, and Kirk Cousins comes in, like he's kind of moving into that Joe Flacco range, because remember, Joe Flacco's won a Super Bowl as well, and which Cousins hasn't. But Flacco is now the veteran. You bring him in as kind of a stopgap. You draft a young quarterback, and he becomes the mentor to the young quarterback. That's probably what Kirk Cousins' lot in life is going to be here over the next few years, as his career begins to wind down now. It's amazing to think that he's 37 years old.
I think there's
Go ahead.
I think there's 3 potential spots that make sense for Kirk Cousins. Carolina, if Bryce Young can't
But
get
they
it
got
figured
Bryce
out.
Young. Yeah.
I don't, as crazy as it sounds, I don't think Minnesota is off the table.
I've actually heard that like that could actually happen. But again, he's going to go be a backup to JJ McCarthy if that happens. He's not going to compete for a job.
I think that Pittsburgh obviously makes sense. And honestly, Tennessee might make sense too, just to be like, while you have Cam Ward, Will Levis is not an NFL quarterback, and he's not even an NFL backup quarterback. So those are kind of the 4 spots that I think. You got Carolina, Minnesota, Pittsburgh, and Tennessee are 4 teams where he'd probably be a backup at 2 of them, and maybe contend to be a starter at the other 2.
And so Irish Ice has brought up Rodgers and Pittsburgh, and that is leading into this next question here. If you're the Steelers, do you keep on waiting for Aaron Rodgers, or would you make a move potentially for Kirk Cousins?
Do I get to put on, what's his name? Arthur, the GM for the Steelers. Is that his name, Arthur? Anyways, do I get to put on the GM cap? Like, is this Jesse the GM, or is
Jesse the GM? Have at it.
Jesse the GM would say, Aaron Rodgers, you're old. You tore your Achilles. Your days are beyond you. You're an old dog at this point. And I personally wouldn't want everything that's coming with Aaron Rodgers at this point. His media baggage, I guess, is what we could call it. And I don't think he's all in on being a competitor anymore. I don't think he's mentally locked in and as sharp as he is of wanting to be great at football. I think those days are past him. I think he has other interests in life, and he's not 100% committed to being a good football player and someone who can like lead or turn around a franchise and seriously lead them through the playoffs. So as crazy as it might sound, I would tell Aaron Rodgers just to kick rocks and roll my dice with Kirk Cousins. I think there's less to lose with Kirk Cousins. Obviously, there's more to gain with Aaron Rodgers, but when you factor in everything, the Steelers have shown that they don't want an elite quarterback. They're completely fine with average quarterback play because they want to rely on their defense so much. So if that's truly your mentality, why bring in all the media baggage and aging, old, injured Aaron Rodgers back when you can just go with good old reliable Kirk Cousins? Like, that's Kirk Cousins' definition of his career, just reliable. He's consistently reliable. And so until you figure out what you want to do at quarterback, just go with Kirk Cousins. I think it's so much less painless to go with him than it is Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah. Omar Khan, by the way, the Pittsburgh Steelers general manager, Arthur Blank is
the owner,
the Falcons owner. Yeah. So you had your teams kind of turned around a little bit. Yeah. Like between the two, one, like they both had the injuries a couple of years ago. And so now they're both Rodgers and Cousins are, just about 2 years removed from those injuries. I guess, since the full recovery, probably about a year and a half or so by the time the season actually starts. But Cousins is younger. And I don't know why, if you're the Pittsburgh Steelers, you would want to keep waiting on Aaron Rodgers, because Josh was asking, is Rodgers getting calls right now? I think that the Steelers are just waiting for Aaron Rodgers to make a decision. That is,
But it's
it's
like,
like
how
it's
are
either
you
going to be
waiting on
Pittsburgh or
him?
nothing. I know.
That's what I mean. Just tell him to make a decision or kick the can, man. Get out of
Yeah.
here.
Now you are going to have to give something up. You're going to have to give up some draft capital for next year to go out and get Kirk Cousins, because it would have to be a trade,
That's
and
true.
whatever his salary looks like, and everything else. But like Rodgers showed, like like the Jets, the Jets made the trade to bring in Devontae Adams, and they had Garrett Wilson, and it's like you had that, and the Jets looked no better than what they did
It just didn't
with
look like he
Rodgers last
cared
year.
out there.
Yeah, yeah. So I would just move on and go with steady Eddie, Kirk Cousins. That feels like the better stopgap to me. If you're the Pittsburgh Steelers, just go with Cousins, and you just tell Rodgers, so long, see you later. Go
That's
with
it. Just
Cousins, and that feels like that's the only place that either one of them is going to be a starting quarterback this year, is Pittsburgh.
yeah, 100% agree. It just seems like Aaron Rodgers is like, oh, like you guys can wait on me. I'm Aaron Rodgers. Like when I make my decision, I make my decisions.
Yep.
I just don't think he's in that point of his career anymore to be making those kind of demands. And like you said, the Jets did everything he asked, and they still were not good.
No.
So it's like, why would you bring all that in? Because he's going to have demands. He's going to be a diva about some stuff. He's going to want this. He's going to want that. For what? To be 500 again? To make the playoffs by one game and be knocked out in the first round? I don't know.
No, I agree. I completely agree. Like Aaron Rodgers has been a diva every place that he's been. I don't know why Mike Tomlin would think that it would be any different in Pittsburgh. And they've got the weapons, like in terms of the receivers, like either one of those guys is going to have it. But Rodgers had it last year again with the Jets, and it didn't pan out. All right, well, that's going to do it for tonight. Jess, enjoyed it as always. Good to see you for the first time this week. I will see you mañana. Appreciate the questions for We In, We Out. Thanks for the lively chat. Even Ray, have a good day. We will talk to you later. If you're still here, smash the like button before you leave, and we'll talk to you tomorrow on IB Nation Sports Talk.
Get my $100 ready.